This is a bit of a weird shaped room, so I shall try and talk in both directions at the same time and stay in the middle. Start off with a bit of exercise to get warmed up. Imagine you have a pen in your hand and look up to the ceiling and draw a nice big circle on the ceiling going clockwise. Okay, has to be a clockwise circle. Okay, so this is a test to see whether you know what clockwise is. Okay, so the direction the hands go round on a clock. So as you're drawing your nice big clockwise circle, keep it going, nice and big, and slowly spiral it down. So keep going, same direction, bring it down until it's kind of round about down at your waist. Keep it going nice and big. And then somebody tell me what direction you're drawing the circle in. Somebody? Counterclockwise. Okay, so one person didn't follow my instructions. Anybody doing a clockwise circle? No. Why didn't you follow my instructions? I said do a clockwise circle. What happened? You can stop drawing now. unless you're trying to work out what the hell just happened. So what happened?
It's more natural, isn't it?
Because you did it. You look at it perspective.
It's perspective. So when you're up there, you're looking at it from above. Sorry, you're looking at it from below. When you're down here, you're looking at it from above. So it looks different. So it's perspective. Exactly the same thing. You're still drawing the same circle. It's just before it looked like it was clockwise, and afterwards it looked like it was anti-clockwise. How many times do you have in your organisations where you're getting into a really heated debate with somebody, and you're debating there kind of going, the circle's clockwise. We've got a clockwise circle, and everybody else is going, no, 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 no. It's a counterclockwise circle. And you're both talking about the same thing. The only thing that's different is you have different perspectives. So I'm going to talk about Kanban, but I'm going to talk about Kanban in a way which for me gives different ways or different perspectives of looking at our Kanban systems. So that's what I like about Kanban. When I discovered Kanban 2007, I was working at Yahoo, was working with teams, we were doing Scrum. It wasn't working. And I was just trying to do Scrum better and figure out why Scrum wasn't working. What I got from Kanban was, oh, here's some different perspectives that I can look at my team's process and the way we're working. And by looking at different perspectives, I can now come up with some different solutions and some different ways of looking at it. So it helped me learn how to solve my problems or my team's problems rather than just trying to implement somebody else's solution or another solution. So that's why, for me, Kanban is a way of creating learning organisations. It's a way of helping teams and organisations learn how to solve their own problems rather than just getting good at implementing other people's solutions. That means I'm not going to give you any answers tonight. And I'll say that now so you can't complain later. This is all about giving you some questions and giving you heuristics that you can use to look at your ways of working, your organisations, and in answering those questions, hopefully come up with your own solutions. So Kanban is a way of designing your own systems, solving your own problems. It's not a solution that you just put in place and copy somebody else. So the way I've been doing that recently, or the way this has evolved, is basically this is the sheet that the kind of copies handed out. Since 2007, I've kind of been figuring out what does Kanban mean for me, how do I use Kanban, what approaches, what techniques do I use when I go into organisations, and I kind of came up with a mental model. So that's what I call Kanban thinking. How do I think about processes, how do I think about ways of working with a model that helps me then work through and help other people think about these things. And then more recently, that kind of model is kind of put into a canvas, which is what this shows here. So this will print out, the idea is actually it prints out on a big A0 piece of paper, and then like most canvases, it becomes a nice, simple, single artifact that a team can collaborate around. You start answering the questions on here, filling out things on post-it notes. You get a single visual representation, you can start joining the dots and hopefully in answering those questions and seeing how all these different pieces and the different perspectives relate to each other, you can come up with some ideas about some things that you can do differently. So we're going to go through this canvas in an hour. It's going to be really high level, really lightning, and essentially we're just going to look at all these questions on here. So I think of these questions as heuristics. So rather than being a solution, and with a solution that you implement, you basically follow the rules. So most processes are a set of rules. Follow these rules and your process will work with you. Kanban is more about heuristics. Answer these questions to figure out your own solution to your problems. So I'll just do a quick kind of orientation. In the middle we have the system. So we're dealing with a system and systems thinking. First thing we need to do is understand what that system is. What do we mean by a system? What's the scope of the system? What's the purpose of the system? Understanding the problem that we're trying to solve. And then when we make some changes to that system, we have 3 arrows coming out of the right-hand side. They're the impact we want to have on the system. So when we make some changes, we want to get some different behavior. Because we're solving a problem rather than implementing a solution, we don't know what the solution is going to look like. So we need some way of figuring out, is this a good solution, is this a bad solution? Is this something we should do more of, or is this something we should do less of? So that's what I call having an impact. If we make some changes to our system, make some changes to our processes, and those things have a positive impact, then we would want to do more of them. If they have a negative impact, then we would want to do less of them. So there's 3 ways of looking at impact: flow, value, and potential. And then we can start looking at, okay, what changes do we want to make? What interventions do we have? So we're going to actually intervene in the system, make some changes, make some action, and there's 5 ways of looking at that. They all begin with S to try and make it memorable. Study, share, stabilise, sense, and search. So those are 5 ways of looking at how we act on the system. Once we've acted on the system, we hope we get some changes in the system behaviour. We can then assess, have those changes had a positive impact or a negative impact? So we'll run through this piece by piece. So the first then is, let's look at the system. And the question here is, what holistic problem, difficulty, or frustration are we trying to address, and who is experiencing it? So we're looking at what problem we're trying to solve. Quite often, if you're on the Kanban Dev mailing list, is anybody on the Kanban Dev mailing list? So I recommend looking at that. So just a Yahoo group, Kanban Dev. People will ask a question on the mailing list about something they want to do with their Kanban system. And more often than not, the first question that they get asked is, well, what problem are you trying to solve? Why do you want to use swim lanes? Why do you want to put some work in process limits? Why do you want to use these metrics? We're talking about practices. We want to put practice in place to solve a problem. What is that problem? So one way of thinking about that is looking at customers and stakeholders. So who is it that's having the problem? That will often help define the scope of the system. If we define the system too small, we might be just looking at kind of a couple of people and solving the problem of a couple of people. That's going to solve the problem, a very local problem. Local optimization, probably not going to make a big impact on your organization. Equally, if we try and make the system too big, we're probably going to end up trying to solve world peace. Maybe not that achievable. So what's the boundaries of the system? Usually it's the organization. Who's our customers? Who are our stakeholders? If we understand the problems that they're trying to solve, then we can start designing some systems that solve their problems, and then there's some emotional buy-in that we get from them. So part of this is starting to understand the change journey and getting some buy-in. So systems thinking then is not just looking at individual events. This is a bit of trying to depict an iceberg. So there's a notion called the systems thinking iceberg, which says that what we actually perceive are individual events. If we just look at those individual events and try and stop those individual events, we're not necessarily going to solve the system problem. We're just going to solve some little isolated pieces. Underneath the iceberg, underneath the water, what we actually have are patterns. So we want to be looking at multiple events and looking at what the patterns of those events are and seeing whether we can change those patterns or seeing whether we can learn anything from those patterns. But actually those patterns themselves are dictated to by the system structure. So the way we design our systems, the way we design our organizations, the way we design our processes are the things that lead to those patterns. And then those patterns become noticeable as the events. And even further down that are our mental models. And actually it's our mental models, the way we think about things, the perspectives that we naturally look at, that's what leads us to design systems in a certain way, and those designs lead to patterns, patterns lead to events. So one of the things we're trying to do with systems thinking is get below the surface. get beyond just looking at individual events and start, the first thing is to start looking for patterns. And we can start finding patterns, we can start using those patterns to help us identify the problems. And then we can look at how do we design the system differently, and maybe do we need to think about the system differently and change our mental models. So my preferred way of looking at this, in a nice fun way, is to use what's called the Pixar Pitch. Anybody know the Pixar Pitch? So this is a little template that will describe any Pixar film. That's why it's called the Pixar Pitch. So as an example, once upon a time there was a widow fish called Marlin who had a son called Nemo. Every day he would say to Nemo, stay close to home, don't go swimming out into the big wide ocean because it's dangerous out there. One day Nemo had a bit of a tantrum and he went out swimming into the ocean. Because of that, he got captured by fishermen and got taken away and ended up in a fish tank in a dentist in Sydney. Because of that, Marlin had to go out and go on an adventure and meet lots of friends to try and rescue Nemo. And because of that, lots of adventures were had until finally they met up, they got back together, they were rescued, everybody lived happily ever after. So nice simple template that you can use to tell a story about what's happened. So what happened in the past? What was going on every day? Who's involved in the story? Who are the key characters in the story? What was a key event? What's the one-day event that's caused some significant thing to happen? And usually this is where we start looking for patterns, because we're trying to generate a generic story here. We're looking at some of the patterns that have happened. What are the key events? What are the consequences of those key events that's led us to the last because of that? So what I'll say is, the last because of that is we're going to go in to do some change. We want to implement a Kanban system. And then the until finally is when we start looking at impact. So we defer the until finally because that's when we start talking about how do we want this story to end. But we start by saying, what's the story that's got us to this place where we are today? So this is where there's a bit of interaction. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to turn to the person next to you and talk about your business situation. So you can either do this as to, if you're not using Kanban and you're thinking about using Kanban, what problem are you trying to solve with Kanban? Or if you have a Kanban system, maybe what was the story of the problem that led you to use Kanban in the first place? Just turn to the person next to you and have a 2-minute conversation around what story would you tell. You can use the template if you want to, or just talk generally about what story would you tell about a problem that you would want to solve using Kanban. And then we're going to build on that as we work through the template. So I'll give you 2 minutes. At the end of the 2 minutes, I'm just going to stand here and put my hand in the air. That's the sign that if you see me putting my hand in the air, you stop talking and you put your hand in the air. And then should filter around the room. Let's run that as a little experiment. All right, so 2 minutes and then I'll bring you back together by putting my hand in the air. Pretty good, not bad. So just a little tangential story. I was working with a customer recently who had a big safe release planning session with about 400 people in a room, big, huge kind of hotel conference room. And they're kind of really well trained on this, put your hand in the air, be silent technique. The facilitator would put their hand in the air and within 2 or 3 seconds, 400 people in silence. Impressive to see. So that's a little technique you can take away. But that's not why we're here. So hopefully I had a kind of talk, and he started talking about the problem and telling some stories to get a feel for, well, what problem are we trying to solve? Why would we want to design and use a Kanban system? And then the next question is, well, if we go and use Kanban, how are we going to know whether it's working or not? So this is what impact do we want to have, or how will we assess the fitness criteria? So generally we're talking about complex systems. And complex systems, there's no right or wrong answer, but there's this idea of a fitness landscape. And depending as you kind of navigate this fitness landscape, there's kind of peaks and troughs. And when you're on a peak, you're in a really good place, and when you're in a trough, you're in a really bad place. So how do we know where we are on the fitness landscape? How do we know whether we're in a peak? That's kind of knowing a good fitness criteria, and when you're in a peak, we can say that's when we're having a good impact. So there's 3 perspectives here to look at this. So the first is flow. We want to have an impact on flow. So we're now looking into the future. So how do we want our story to end? Or more generally, what stories would we want people to be telling in the future? So what stories might we want people to tell in the future about the work going through a perfect process which has reliability and efficiency? So flow is about the process. Let's imagine we have a really, really good process, the perfect process, where work just kind of works its way through it. So it's really reliable because we know as soon as we put a piece of work into the process, it just comes out the other end really, really quickly. We know it's going to come out, we know when it's going to come out. So it's reliable and it's really, really efficient. So the work kind of goes through there, constantly moving, there's no delays, no bottlenecks, no constraints. So flow is about process, reliability, efficiency. And we want to, so this is, say, the until finally piece of the story. How do we want this story to end? And we want to look at from 2 extremes. One, what would be the impossibly good ending? Let's imagine it is absolutely perfect. It's the utopia for our organisation. What would that look like? But they probably want to look at the other side of it, which is what would be the impossibly bad ending be? So the impossibly good ending is we're at a kind of the peak of on a fitness landscape. The impossibly bad ending is we've ended up in a trough, in a hole on the fitness landscape. If we can know both those things, and we can start getting a feel for the sort of stories we want people telling, then when we actually get into the future, we can start asking questions like, are these stories more like these good ones? Is what we're experiencing more like these good stories that we talked about? Or is what we're experiencing more like these bad stories, these awful stories that we talked about? If we're getting more stories like the good ones, then we're probably having a positive impact. If we're getting more stories like the bad ones, then we're probably having a negative impact. So we're not getting hung up on exactly what the future is going to look like and what the solution is going to look like, but we're getting feel for how will we know whether it's good or bad. And then when we can run in and running some experiments and getting to design, we know how we're going to assess against that. So that's flow. So impossibly good endings and possibly bad endings for flow, but we can have really, really good flow and still deliver no value. So we want to think from the value perspective as well. So now it's what stories might be told about the work creating an unbeatable product which has validity and effectiveness. So if flow is about the process, value is about the product. So as well as just having a really good process, we want to be delivering this great unbeatable product. So let's imagine the future when we have the best product we can. Or let's imagine the future when we have the worst product we can. So let's look at it from the utopian, dystopian perspectives again. And if we have this unbeatable product, then we're talking more about the validity of what we're doing rather than the reliability. So process is generally about being reliable, doing things in a really efficient way. Value is about being valid, doing the right work, and being really effective about it. So we're kind of starting to bring up some patterns here around flow and value is process and product. It's efficiency versus effectiveness. It's reliability versus validity. And then the third piece is potential. So we can have a really good process, a really good flow, and we begin delivering a really good product and have really good value, but it's not sustainable. So being sustainable is about having potential as well. So long-term potential. So being able to do things sustainably. So this is telling stories about work being done by really passionate people. If we have passionate people, then it's probably going to be they're going to want to keep doing it over and over time. Passionate people who have flexibility and euphoria. So flexibility is that we can adapt as the market changes, as the landscape changes, as technology changes. We can adapt. We can be flexible just to go with it. And euphoria is about if we got happy people. We don't want to be beating people. We don't want to be people having a good flow and delivering good product because we're just beating them with a stick. So happy people, passionate people. So we've got 3 triads now. We've got flow, value, and potential. And what you find is that there's no kind of neat distinction between, this is about flow and this is about value. If you think of them about corners of a triangle, the stories that we're going to start telling are going to sit somewhere in them. And some will be more about flow, but there'll be a little bit about potential. And some of them will be a bit about potential, but maybe a bit about value. And you start building up a kind of space within this triangle. So the corners there, flow, value, and potential, which is reliability, validity, and flexibility. They're your three ilities. Then you've got efficiency, effectiveness, and euphoria. Euphoria was the closest thing I could find for a third F word. The other way that's not in the questions is flow is about doing the thing right, value is doing the right thing, and potential is about doing the thing sustainably. So I think we need all three of those things, and the idea of having all three as impacts is we don't want to fixate on one. If we just focus on flow, then we might forget about that. Actually, why are we doing this? What are we building? And maybe we kind of focus on flow at the expense of thinking about the people. So we want all three in there. So given that the problem and the stories you just started telling each other about the problems you're trying to solve, you're now going to get 2 minutes to start thinking into the future and start talking about what stories, what futures do we want, good stories, bad stories, good futures, bad stories, with regard to flow, value, and potential. So try and get one of each. It's only 2 minutes, so I know it's kind of lightning quick. But don't get hung up. It's this kind of brainstorming thing. Just think about what would be really, really good futures with perfect flow, unbeatable product, passionate people, and what would be the kind of really dystopian futures if we had none of those things and it all went horribly wrong. So 2 minutes, and then we'll do the whole raising your hand and coming back together again. Much quicker. So what we've just done there is I've intentionally deferred the natural tendency we have to dive into solutions and jump into what we want to do is we want to do this and put this practice in place and create a Kanban board and put some WIP limits in. Really pushing back on that and thinking about, well, actually, what problem are we trying to solve and what are we trying to achieve here? Now we've done that, we can start going into interventions. So interventions are actually what can we do to have a positive impact. Now we've thought about what we mean by positive impact. We can start thinking about, right, what practices can we start trying out? What things can we do differently so that hopefully we can make things better? So the first of those is what I call studying. So Kanban is generally, we talk about start where you are now. We don't go in and we don't change anything, we just understand the present situation and we do evolutionary change from there. So if we're going to start with where we are now, we need to understand where we are, so we need to study where we are. So a lot of practices that we use are actually, I think, about studying. There are questions that we're trying to answer here. What can we do to learn more about our customers and stakeholders' needs, the resultant demand from them, and how we process that demand, how that demand is processed? There's three elements to that. First is going in and learning more about our customers, we've kind of identified our customer or stakeholders and the problem we're trying to solve. Let's learn some more about that. And we can do that with something like empathy mapping. Anybody familiar with empathy mapping as a practice? I can see one hand up. So empathy mapping is a technique where you go out and you spend time with your customers or stakeholders. So I kind of like to think about it as spending time in their shoes. It's very much about having empathy rather than having sympathy with them. So there's a nice little video, I think it's an RSA animation, which describes the difference nicely, which is if there's somebody stuck in a hole, being miserable in a hole, if you just kind of put your head in the hole and look down there and kind of go, that looks tough down there, sorry about that, that's having sympathy. If you actually get down into the hole with them and experience that hole with them, that's having empathy. So this is going in and spending time with people, really understanding and feeling their pain rather than just kind of observing from a distance. So what empathy mapping does is you spend time with people and there's just a little, there's variations on it, but essentially most of them have 4 quadrants and you start identifying what things are these people saying, what are they seeing, what are they thinking, what are they doing. Again, 4 different perspectives to look at and understanding your customers from. And then from that you can pull out a little statement such as this person needs a way to meet some need, solve some problem because this is their current situation. So come up with a nice little template. So you wouldn't necessarily do the whole empathy map on the canvas. You would take empathy mapping as a practice that we can use to study more about our customer stakeholders, and then we can bring that learning back and capture it on the canvas. Then we can start looking at the demand. So we get work from our customers, our stakeholders. Are we doing some work from them? There's various techniques, practices we can use to learn more about that. One is classes of service. So the notion of classes of service is not all work is equal. Some work is more important, some work is less important. There's different costs of delay. Can we use those to understand the different type of work and start managing that work better? Sometimes just understanding failure demand and value demand. So which work or what work are we doing because it generally adds value to our customers. They really want us to do it. And what work are we doing because we mucked up, we failed in the first place, or we're doing remedial work because we didn't do something quite right in the first place. Just that simple distinction on its own helps us start understanding what do we do differently so we can spend more time doing value demand and less time doing failure demand. You don't want to optimize failure demand, you want to eliminate failure demand. If you can eliminate the failure demand, suddenly your capacity to do value demand goes up, you deliver more value. No changes to the process, just understanding more about the work. So there's different techniques therefore to understand the demand and using demand analysis. And then we look at the way we do the work, and this is where value stream mapping comes in. So whatever you want to call it, value stream mapping, value network analysis, value network creation, knowledge mapping, different people call it different things. To me it's all the same thing. What we're doing is studying the way we do the work. Studying what happens to the work from saying yes, we'll accept that, we'll do it, through to delivering it and the customer actually realizing the value from it. Well, what we're generally looking for is we're looking for where are the delays in that process. If we're trying to improve the process, where does work get delayed that we can remove the delays? So that's generally when it works in queues, works in buffers. Maybe where do we need to make really important decisions about the work? And when what information do we need to get those decisions? So those are generally key points in our process. Knowledge to get decisions. And then where are the feedback loops? Either feedback loops which are good feedback loops because we've got good learning and we can learn from that, or feedback loops which are negative feedback loops because we didn't do something right. So a feedback loop where we learn that we've built slightly the wrong thing and we can improve it is a good feedback loop. A feedback loop where we discover we've got lots of defects which could have been avoided in the first place, not such a good feedback loop. So look, those are the three things I kind of generally like to look for when I'm doing value stream mapping. Where are delays in the process? Where are key decision points that we need to make sure we've got the right information? Where are the feedback loops that we want to either amplify and do better, or maybe we want to get rid of because we're not doing very good work? So there's three ways of looking at your process, looking at it from learning more about your customer, learning more about the nature of the work, and learning more about the way you do your work. So given the problems that you just talked about, you're now going to get 2 minutes to talk about, basically answer this question. What would you want to learn about? Obviously you're not going to have a chance to go off and do the practice, but maybe talk about, I really wish I knew more about our customers, or I think we could learn more by doing some sort of value stream mapping, and this is the sort of stuff I think we could learn about. Or I'd like to learn, I don't think all our work is equal, I'd like to learn more about the nature of the work that we're doing. So spend 2 minutes talking about that. Again, it relates back to the problem that you initially talked about. Given the problem that you have, that you're putting Kanban in place, what do you want to study to learn more that's going to be the basis for improvement? So 2 minutes. So you've done some studying, put some practices in place to learn more. You've got a better understanding about your problem now. Now you want to share that understanding. If it's just you got understanding, or maybe different people have got an understanding, but their understanding is slightly different, you're not going to be aligned, you're not necessarily all going to be heading in the same direction. So sharing is about sharing that understanding and sharing that knowledge that we get from studying, so that now we can use that shared understanding to, again, for a basis for improvement. So here it's like, the question is, what information, and we've just studied and we've learned information, what information is important to share, and how can tokens, inscriptions on them, and placement of them provide a single visual model. So we're really talking about visualization here, mostly Kanban boards, but not necessarily exclusive to that. If we try and share all the different bits of information, everything that we could, we're going to get information overload. So getting some agreement and alignment about what's the important things that we want to share, that we need to all have a common understanding of to help us improve, and then how do we visualize that? So this is just a kind of quick example of some different types of information. So you start off with scope, time, cost, quality, kind of the four sides of the iron triangle, but then there's a whole load more. And there's a question mark there because this is an exhaustive list. You can come up with more, and I've been in places and they said, oh, actually there's this other thing that we want to visualize. So having a discussion as a team, as an organization, around what's important to us that we want to share, so we're not trying to share everything, but then actually how do we visualize that? How do we make that in a visual module? There's a pattern that I call token inscription placement. Token is, that's the index card or the post-it note or the thing that's going to represent usually a piece of work. And then token themselves, if we think about an index card, it can have different sizes, different colors, different shapes, or actually different material, because it could be an index card, it could be a post-it note. So we can use the attributes of the token itself to convey information. So if we're looking at demand, let's say we talked about value demand and failure demand, we could represent value demand using the color attribute of a token. Value demand we use green cards for, failure demand we use red cards for. So we're going to use an attribute of the token to represent the type of demand. But equally, we could use an inscription. So inscription is we write something or we put some information onto the token. Words, dates, numbers, symbols, initials, pictures, lots of things that we can put onto the token. So again, we could just write value and failure and inscribe it onto the token or something else. So we can put that and write it on the token. Or the third bit is placement. So where we put the token on the board also conveys information. So typically columns and swim lanes. So let's say we want to use swim lanes and a horizontal row. We have a horizontal row for all the value demand, and we have a horizontal row for all the failure demand. So there's three ways of conveying whether this is failure demand or value demand. We can use an attribute of the token, we can inscribe something on the token, or we can use where we place the token on the board. There's no single right answer. Part of the design activity with sharing is let's figure out what information do we want to convey, and then let's think about, for us, what makes most sense to convey this information. And out of that information and then deciding how you're going to share it, a design of a board will evolve. So the next 2 minutes is thinking about the information that hopefully you got from your studied. How would you share that? So what information do you want to share? And then think about how you might either use tokens, inscriptions, or placements to share that information as you build up a Kanban board design. So I'm going to give you another 2 minutes. So let's imagine you've got a board now. You've started creating a shared understanding. Not necessarily actually changed anything yet. So even though these are called interventions, they're interventions because you are subtly making some changes. They're just not really that direct and active. But sometimes just by going out and studying the work and visualizing the work, you do get some changes happening because people suddenly get more awareness and understanding of what's going on. But we start to get into maybe making some more direct changes, immediate changes, when we get into stabilizing the system. So stabilizing, again, it's the word is chosen partly because it begins with the letter S, but it's the intent behind WIP limits and policies in Kanban. So what policies can we use which are going to help limit work in process and remove unnecessary and unexpected delays or rework? So systems have constraints. And systems have boundaries. If the system is too constrained and the boundaries are too tight, then as soon as something unexpected happens, it just breaks. So we don't want systems that are too constrained and too tight. That's heavy bureaucracy. And actually what tends to happen is if it breaks because actually people start breaking the rules and then things don't work. And then at the other extent, if you've got absolutely no constraints or no boundaries at all, you've got chaos. Just anything can happen in any order, anybody can do whatever they like. So we're trying to find a nice balancing point in the middle where we have some constraints and some boundaries that allow us to do our work in the way that we want, allow us to do the right work in the right way, avoiding chaos but not being overly constrained so that we're heavily bureaucratic. So the key way that we do that in Kanban is WIP limits. That's one kind of, I guess we call that out because that's really what makes it a Kanban system. We should only work on this amount of work. We should only work on this number of work items. How we work on it, what they are, we're not so worried about. We're going to give you some flexibility, but if we work on too much, we're going to get chaos. Equally, if we're too bureaucratic and say it's 2 and it's only 2 and it must never change, probably as you learn and as you get these unexpected events, you're not going to be able to deal with them. So the idea of expediting a work item and basically saying we're going to let you break our WIP limit by 1 for expedited work allows us some flexibility in those boundaries and allows us to learn. So the kind of technical term is permeable boundaries. So we can move through them, we can move back and forwards. They're not like kind of rigid fences. So WIP limits is one way that we just put some boundaries around the work. And then policies, the way we do the work, is the other way. So what does it mean for us, for the work, and for the work to move forward from dev into QA? Let's say we want to understand what work is mostly dev, what work is mostly test. What does it mean for the work to move from there to there? We have some quality criteria or some definition of done, or some exit policy, some way of saying we should have code should be checked in, it should be integrated, it should have unit tests, it should be documented, etc. Those are all policies that we want to put in place that help us understand the way we should do the work. Again, those are flexible, so that's those policies are our baseline for improvement almost. So they're not a bureaucratic thing that's the way it's always going to be, that's the perfection. That's the best way we know now that help the system become stable, help us understand the way we think we should do the work, and then we can improve from there. So if you've got a chaotic system, it's really difficult to improve because just everything's all over the place. So starting to stabilize, starting to bring some policies in place, stabilize that work, and then once it's stable, we can figure out how to improve it. So we talk about what's our approach to WIP limits, where does it make sense to limit work in process, where do we have too much work, does it make sense to limit by swim lane or by column or by work type or by person. We don't necessarily need to get down to what's the exact number because there's no magic formula, but generally you can have a conversation around what's our general approach going to be to limiting work in process, and then what other policies, either entry or exit policies for columns on your board, definition of ready, definition of done are typical Scrum things that Scrum teams do. It's basically they're a set of policies to help us understand and manage the work. Or just more generically, what's the quality criteria? So when you pull a piece of work, I like the notion that the work should be clean. What does it mean for the work to be clean? So when we pull it, it's ready for us to work on. If it's not ready, then that's when we start getting these negative feedback loops because the work has to go back to be redone. So the next 2 minutes is talking about what would your approach be? How might you use work in process limits to start stabilizing your system and start to solve your problem? Or what sort of policies might you put in place to start stabilizing the system, to start solving this problem and having the positive impact? So another 2 minutes. Great, thank you. So if we have a stable system in place now, hopefully we're now in a place where we can start improving, but we still, maybe we don't know whether we're improving. So this is where we start needing to get, actually, how good are we? What's our sense of capability or sense of system capability? If we can start getting a sense of the system capability, then as we start making changes, now we can really get down to getting a finer level of detail of, are we getting better or are we getting worse? So this is where I talk about measures and meetings. So what measures and meetings might create insights and guide decisions on potential interventions? So measures, we can start putting together some metrics to help us give us a little bit more detail about whether having a positive impact. So you start going back to, let's think about what it means to have a positive impact and what outcomes, what actually, a little bit more detail and granular, what outcomes do we think will lead to that impact? So by outcomes I mean things like we're going to be more productive. So if we want to have greater flow, we think if we're more productive, probably means we've got better flow. Or maybe from a value perspective, we can say, if we have an outcome where we have better customer satisfaction, then that probably means we're delivering more value. So we can just get a little bit more concrete. So the 6 I like to use are productivity, how much work are we doing, reliability, so are we delivering what we said we could do when we said we'd do it, responsiveness, so how quickly can we deliver stuff, so when we get asked for something, how quickly can we deliver it, quality, speaks for itself, so how good is the work that we're doing, customer satisfaction, are we delivering the right thing, employee satisfaction, are we working in a way that is treating our people fairly. So using things like those 6, we can then say, what do we actually measure? So we're working back from impacts rather than jumping straight into the measures. But if we want to have an impact on flow, we think if we have better flow, that's responsiveness. So better flow means we're delivering work more quickly. So we're more responsive outcomes. To measure that, we're going to measure lead time. So time from starting a piece of work to ending it. Then, well, what behaviour is that going to drive? Well, hopefully it's going to drive some behaviour where people focus on finishing work before they start new work, and we can use work in process limits to help with that. But maybe it's going to drive some other behaviours that we need to think about. So it might drive some behaviours where people start cutting corners and reducing quality, and so actually we don't want to impact our quality. So quality is still an important outcome. So let's put a metric in place that measures quality. Now that might be reported defects in the field, or you could still measure quality through your customer service desks if you have some access to those metrics. So then what behaviour do we want that to drive? So hopefully that's people are going to stop cutting corners and do the right thing. Are there any trade-offs there? Well, maybe people will slow down and we'll get less work done, so that's now going to impact on productivity. So we're now getting to what are the trade-offs? We can't have everything, there's no silver bullet, but we need to intentionally think about, given what we think is important, what are the different outcomes that we might have, how do we balance those? If we focus too much on responsiveness, then we might end up with poor predictability, poor quality. We probably don't want that to happen, but we should at least think through that. So that's thinking through about what measures do we want to have in place, but not just jumping straight in with the measures. We work our way back to the measures from impact. And then what meetings do we have? So meetings are effectively feedback cadences, or good meetings are feedback cadences. So if we look at the meetings that you have in Scrum, for example, effectively that's a 2-week feedback cadence where you get feedback on how good you are at planning, how good you are at delivering, how good your process is, how good you are at releasing, and it's a nice cadence. It's much more qualitative. So metrics give you very objective, very quantitative metrics. Cadences and feedbacks give you much more qualitative and much more subjective feedback, but you want both. So thinking about all the different things you do, scheduling, planning, reporting, and the list there, and again, question mark because it's not an exhaustive list. What cadences might you put in place, and how frequent are those cadences? So you might want to do scheduling more frequently than you do retrospecting. You might be releasing every day. So thinking about these different events, what are the right cadences that are going to give you some good feedback, maybe not too much feedback. If you start retrospecting every day, it might not be worth it. You want to have some kind of time to run some things, make some changes, let that bed in. Sometimes these cadences are not time-based, sometimes they're trigger-based. So teams have done retrospectives where actually they'll have a separate little board, and every time there's a little problem comes up that they want to work on, they'll write a ticket, put a post-it note on the retrospective board, and they'll have a retrospective when they have 3 things to discuss. So it's not time-based, it's signalled by the number of things, the amount of problems they're having. So there's the 2 things to talk about when you're sensing. What metrics might you want to put in place to measure what you're doing, get a sense of it, and what are the feedback cadences that you would want? What meetings and how often do you want those? So another 2 minutes, actually let's cut this down to a minute because I'm running late. So a minute just to talk about either measures or meetings, if you probably haven't got time to do both. Okay, that was really quick. So the last section is then searching. So this is really where we get into making some changes, and what we're doing is searching around the landscape of all the possible changes we could make, of all the possible alternative processes and practices we might use. We want to search around and try and find what the best ones are. So which ones are going to have positive impact, which ones do we want to avoid because they're going to have negative impact. So what we're actually doing now is starting to run experiments. So what small experiments can we run to safely learn the impact of different interventions? So given that all the things you've talked about, the things that you studied, the way that information that you might want to visualize, the WIP limits, the policies you might want to place, the metrics you might want to use, the different meeting cadences you might want to use, all those things that you've talked about are hypotheses, they're ideas. What we actually want to do is run some experiments. So come up with some ideas and some hypotheses around, if we change X, then we think it's going to improve our process in some way, improve Y, because of Z. So what's the rationale behind it? So we're not just kind of randomly doing things. We want these experiments to be kind of coherent. So we look back across the canvas and we say, given all the things we've talked about and how we think they all fit together, let's run an experiment to put a WIP limit in place because we think it's going to improve our responsiveness, our lead time. So we can start looking back and using some of the metrics that we used and we thought would be important. And hopefully we can come up with some rationale because we've talked our way towards this. So the measures that are important, this is almost kind of a scientific approach to this. So we run a little experiment and we use the metrics to either validate or invalidate our experiment. And hopefully we validate it, we say that's a good thing, we want to keep doing that, or maybe we want to do more of it. If we invalidate it, then we say, okay, that's okay. Our hypothesis was wrong, but we always make sure we've got an ability to recover. So that's the aspect of making these hypotheses and experiments safe. Small and safe, so that if we need to reverse out of it, we've not spent millions of pounds and we've not fired people and we've not killed off some kind of product that we thought was important. So little experiments, make them safe, have a hypothesis, run the experiment, and then we get into a cycle. So then as we run the experiments and we learn more, then maybe what we have to do is we go back and we need to just study something else. We decide that we want to change our visualization. So the canvas then becomes something that we can keep going back to and keep following up as we move into just a continuous cycle of continuous experimentation. So that's what Kanban is for me. It's a way of having a framework to think about how do we experiment with our process so that we can design our own process that works for us, that solves our problems. So your last, I'll give you 90 seconds, 90-second conversation would be come up with a hypothesis. What experiment would you run? How would you make it safe? How would you measure it? And then we'll wrap up. All right, so that is a really high level, really kind of lightning fast fly through of the canvas. It's kind of the way I use it. Generally, when I use this with the organisations, I spend 2 days rather than an hour. But my goal is just to give you a sense of what these different perspectives are. Okay. So kanbanthinking.net is where you can download this from. So feel free to download it and use it. It's all Creative Commons. And my one little sales pitch. So I'm an independent consultant and I am more than happy to come in and kind of do a deeper dive 2-day or whatever workshop if you would like me to. Otherwise, thank you very much.